Mr. President, 1 week ago, the Republican Majority Leader made an announcement that stunned a lot of observers on Capitol Hill. Senator McConnell said that the Senate Republicans would basically turn their back on what I consider to be a constitutional responsibility, and that they refused to consider the nomination to fill the vacancy of Justice Scalia, who recently passed away. The Founding Fathers in the Constitution established a very clear process for appointing Supreme Court justices. In Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, under the Constitution, the President, quote, shall nominate and by and with the advice and the consent of the Senate shall appoint judges of the Supreme Court. That's the language of the Constitution. It's explicit. The President has a constitutional obligation to send a Supreme Court nominee to the Senate, and the Senate has a constitutional obligation to consider the nominee. But the Majority Leader for the Republicans said last week that he would not give any consideration to a nominee sent by President Obama. Not a hearing, not a vote, and then he went so far as to say, I won't even meet with that nominee. This is a stunning abdication of the Senate's constitutional responsibility. Each of us as senators walk down this aisle, stand over to the side, raise our right hands, and swear to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States and to bear truth, faith, and allegiance to it. It is an oath each of us takes very seriously. The Majority Leader has tried to justify his decision by noting that this is a different year. This isn't another year, it's an election year, he says. Well, it turns out it doesn't take much constitutional study to realize the Constitution applies to election years as well as every other year. There's nothing in the Constitution that directs the President or the Senate to ignore their responsibility when there is a political presidential campaign underway. I've searched the Constitution. There is no reference whatsoever to a presidential campaign year absolving either the President or the Senate from their constitutional obligation. One of the great ironies of the decision by the Senate Republican leadership was the way they reached it. Shortly after Justice Scalia passed away, Majority Leader McConnell issued a statement saying, quote, the American people should have a voice in the selection of the next Supreme Court justice. Then last Tuesday, he summoned the Republican members of the Senate Judiciary Committee to his office. And there he decided, with them, that they would deprive the American people of a chance to have a hearing on President Obama's nominee to fill the Scalia vacancy. This is an unprecedented obstruction of a Supreme Court nominee. And this decision to obstruct certainly wasn't made by the American people. It was a unilateral partisan decision made by a handful of senators behind closed doors. The Republican senators didn't bring their decision out into the open, not to a hearing of the Judiciary Committee, which they chair. They did it quietly behind closed doors. But the American people heard what happened. Last Friday, a letter was sent to the Republican members of the Judiciary Committee by the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and Human Rights and 81 other national organizations. I ask unanimous consent that the letter be included in the record of this moment.
Without objection.
Thanks, Mr. President. The letter described the Republicans' obstruction as, quote, a clear perversion of your constitutional duties as understood by almost every scholarly authority on the topic and by most Americans. The letter said that the Constitution, quote, does not give a select few senators veto power over a president's role in selecting and nominating a candidate. The Senate's duty is to evaluate a nominee's fitness and qualifications, not to pick the president making the nomination, end of quote. Well, I agree with that statement. By unilaterally refusing to give any consideration to any nominee made by this president, Senate Republicans are trying to stop this president from fulfilling his constitutional responsibility to nominate and appoint Supreme Court justices under Article 2, Section 2. And they did it in secret, in a back room, behind closed doors. Why are they so afraid to give President Obama's nominee a fair hearing? Are they concerned that if the nominee is well qualified and they turn that person down, that it will reflect poorly on the Senate Republicans? The Senate Republican process of secrecy and obstruction is inconsistent with the Constitution. It does a disservice to the Supreme Court, to the President, and to the American people. And let me say that I raised a point last week which is worth returning to. The argument is made that the next president should pick the nominee to fill this vacancy. The argument is made that the American people, when they select the next president in November of this year, will be saying to the American people, you make the choice. You select the president, then you'll know the Supreme Court nominee. Well, there may be some logic to that, but for one thing, we have a president. He was elected in 2012 with a 5 million vote majority. This is the 4th year of his presidency. When you listen to the Republicans argue, you would think, wait a minute, Barack Obama was not elected for 4 years, only for 3 years and 2 months. They argued at this point in time, this president does not have the constitutional authority or responsibility to fill the vacancy of Justice Scalia. The American people spoke. It wasn't all that close. By a margin of 5 million votes, they chose this president for 4 years, not for 3 years or 3 years and 2 months. He is the president, and he has the authority of the presidency. And he has that authority not given to him by God, but by the American people. And it's authority which should not be taken away by the Republican majority in the Senate. Their argument, wait for the next election, you know what that means, Mr. President? It means if they have their way, if they fail to do their job, if they don't even have a hearing for President Obama's nominee, don't even bring it to a vote, and the vacancy continues on the Supreme Court, it will be historic. The last time that we will have had a vacancy of this duration on the Supreme Court dates back to the Civil War. A nation at war with itself left a vacancy for more than a year on the Supreme Court. And now, the Senate Republicans of 2016 want to leave a vacancy on the Supreme Court for over a year. There's no need for it, and the Constitution certainly makes it clear how this vacancy should be filled. There's no secret that there is a political motive. The Senate Republicans hope that Justice Scalia's seat will be filled by a person that they choose. This is a political calculation they're willing to make, to take the heat for not following their constitutional responsibility in the hopes that a President Trump will pick someone to fill this vacancy, or some other Republican president in the future. That's what they're counting on. That's political. Politics shouldn't trump the Constitution. Nothing should trump the Constitution when it comes to governing the United States. Because it's an election year doesn't mean senators can take a year-long break and ignore their own oath of office. It is time for the Senate Republicans to do their job. The President and the Senate must fulfill their constitutional responsibility. In times of war, in economic depression, yes, even in an election year. Last week, Majority Leader McConnell reportedly told a group of House Republicans there isn't, quote, a snowball's chance in hell, close quote, that he would back down from his plan of obstruction. Nevertheless, today, President Obama has invited Majority Leader McConnell to meet with him in the White House to discuss the Supreme Court vacancy. They've also invited the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Grassley, the ranking Democrat, Senator Leahy, and, of course, the minority leader of the Senate, Senator Reid. Why did the president offer this meeting? Because that's what always happens. When a president is about to consider filling such an historic vacancy, he brings together the leaders of the Senate to discuss his thought process and perhaps to solicit names from them of potential nominees. Even when we've disagreed in the past and had presidents and senators from different political parties, they still extended that courtesy to one another. President Obama is extending the majority leader that courtesy, even if the majority leader has made it clear and publicly stated repeatedly that he will not even meet with, let alone consider, the president's nominee. I hope the president is setting a good example of what should be done in this circumstance, where the president follows tradition and the Constitution. I'm glad the president's taking this seriously. I know he's in the midst of a careful, deliberative process to choose a nominee. The president should select an outstanding person that has the qualifications, a commitment to justice, a deep respect for the role of the judiciary, and life experience that point toward integrity and good judgment. The president's doing his job as the Constitution requires. My Republican colleagues in the Senate should do their job as well. They should honor the process established in the Constitution and give the president's nominee fair consideration, a hearing, and a vote.